And tonight we're going to take a look at the Song of Solomon, also known as the Song of Songs, sometimes known as Canticles. It's a love song, probably was written originally as a play on the occasion of one of Solomon's marriages. We're not sure exactly the circumstances, but it's a very controversial Old Testament book. When you get to the New Testament, and Paul writes to us and says that all Scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction and instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be complete and thoroughly furnished for every good work. There's some Old Testament Scripture that's easier to put into that formula than others. And this is one that down through the centuries, people have wrestled with. Right? So he's still excited about life. He's probably a young man. There's a king in the Song of Songs, and we assume that it's Solomon. There's a list given at the time that this king has 60 wives and 80 concubines. So if it's Solomon, it's pretty early in his career because he ends up with 700 wives and 300 concubines. This would have been one of the earlier wives. If it is the bride that we think it is, there is a possibility at least that it was the Shunammite woman who lived with David late in his life, named Abishag. So it's all possible. We're not sure of a lot of things. What we are sure is that the book itself is romantic and at times almost too descriptive of the love between this man and his bride-to-be. And so we'll look at that here in a little bit. The bride is a daughter of Pharaoh. She's dark-skinned. She is, let's see, in verse 5, she says, "Dark am I, yet lovely, daughters of Jerusalem, dark like the tents of Kedar, like the tent curtains of Solomon." So she's darker than the rest of the girls in Solomon's company. So whoever she is, she may be an African woman or at least an Egyptian that's very dark-skinned. "Do not stare at me because I'm dark, because I am darkened by the sun. My mother's sons were angry with me and made me take care of the vineyards. My own vineyard I had to neglect. Tell me, you whom I love, where you graze your flock and where you rest your sheep at midday. Why should I be like a veiled woman beside the flocks of your friends?" So she says, I'm in love with you and I want to be with you, and where you are is where I want to be. How come you're leaving me somewhere else? So at least in the newest version of the King James, it is divided up into a play. And so a lot of people believe that this was a play that was performed on their behalf at the wedding, or it may be what's known as a spring play. It's about the rebirth of life and the joy of matrimony and the attraction between a man and a woman. So the obvious controversy, if you've read this work, is that it's a little too erotic for Scripture. It has some references in it that are not about the purity of life and the sanctity of quiet, peaceful romance. It's full-blown. These two are in love and they want to be together. And so some of it is difficult to place easily into Scripture, but at the same time, there are other books and other places where pure physical attraction is talked about. The Old Testament, in fact, is full of sexual references, sometimes very, very pure and sometimes not so pure. But Scriptures as a whole applaud married sexuality. You remember what the Hebrew writer says? The marriage bed is not defiled. Right? That God looks favorably on the love between husbands and wives. Some people have said the work's just too secular. There's no mention of God in this. There's no mention of the temple. There's no mention of the law of Moses. There's a couple of other books in the Old Testament that do not talk specifically about God or about his relationship with the Israelite people, but this one is pretty devoid of any of those references. God is not the center of attention in the Song of Solomon. This couple is the center of attention. They're surrounded by their friends, and their friends, sometimes called the friends and sometimes called the women or the girls or the females of Jerusalem who are looking on. They all have something to say about the upcoming marriage of these two. So, does the work belong in Scripture? Right? All Scripture is inspired, which begs the question, if this is not worthy of being in the Old Testament, is it really inspired? So some people have gone at it that way. Well, we just don't think it's inspired. And some of the folks who gathered Scripture together just omitted this. They said, well, it's just too physical to be Scripture. So here are some methods of interpretation that have been used to try to figure out what to do with it. Probably the most popular, especially early on, was the allegorical approach. It's just an extended metaphor. The king is not really the king, and the bride is not really the bride. They mean something else. And most of it has to do with the love represents the relationship either between God and his people Israel or between Christ and the church. Right? We are the bride of Christ. The problem with it is that the song becomes it's difficult for me to think of sexual love in terms of God and the people of Israel or Christ and his church. That doesn't seem to fit. The official Catholic Church stance is that it's the love of God for the Virgin Mary. Right? So celibacy is celebrated in Mary above marriage. Right? She's not famous or applauded for her marriage. She's famous and applauded because she was a chaste virgin when she got married. So none of those really make a lot of sense to me. There was a fellow named Akiba, and this is what he thought about it. The entire history of the world, from the beginning to this very day, does not outshine the day on which this book was given to Israel. All Scripture is holy, but the Song of Songs is the Holy of Holies. That's odd to me, why he would hold it in that high of a regard. What's wrong with the allegorical approach? Well, there's no indication in the text that this is an allegory or a metaphor. It's just talking about two people in love. Why use the names of real people and places? If it's just an allegory, you could have omitted those. Solomon is mentioned by name. Jerusalem is mentioned by name. Lebanon is mentioned by name. And there's no progressive storyline. There's no moral to the story. When you get to the end of an extended metaphor, you've usually got a lesson that you can learn at the end. There's no lesson to be learned at the end of this. It's just a way of expressing something between this king and his bride. Another way of interpreting it is called the natural or the historical method. And they say, well, it's just an actual exchange between two people. This is the one that I think is legitimate. Between Solomon and Abishag, maybe between Solomon and another one of his wives. It accepts the work as a tribute to married love. These two are madly in love with each other. They're getting ready to be married. They're looking forward to the time when they can be married. And we should just take it at face value. And then finally, there's the dramatic, where people think that maybe it's a play, that it was just written and Solomon's name was inserted because he was well known, and so they wrote the play about him and about one of his wives, but that it wasn't necessarily about him particularly, just that his name was used. There's one last one, and this one you can just disregard, but I want you to be familiar with it. There's the cultic or mythological. There were spring cults in those days. Usually, the god had a consort. So when you hear the name Baal, do you not automatically think, and Ashtaroth, right? Baal and Ashtaroth. So the idea was that in the spring, all of nature wakes back up and all of nature comes together, and it's a very erotic, very sexual, very moving life forward kind of event. And so some people think that this was written in that terms, that it was written for gods that were not the God of Israel. But if you read the Song of Solomon, they had to work hard to decide that that's what they thought it meant. It just doesn't fit. And again, it has to do with Solomon. So if you put Solomon's name in it, you're talking about God's representative, the king over Israel. And so it doesn't make a lot of sense that it would be about some foreign god in the spring. All right, I'm going to give you a quick run through the chapters. We're not going to read all of it. I used to make my students do this, by the way. I would make my students read the entire Song of Solomon out loud in class. I had college students, so most of them were fine with it. But every now and then we would have a few blushes and a few people that would say pass, and they would want somebody else to read their passage for them. But there's a progression of these two talking about how they feel about each other. And so like in chapter 1, the bride talks about her love for the king. We read a little bit about it just a minute ago. Why is it that I have to have my stuff over here and be covered from head to toe? Why can't I just be with you where you are? Why do we have to hide? Why can't I just go ahead and come home with you? Why do I need to be separated from you? Oh, come on. The Beach Boys. Wouldn't it be nice if we were older? Then we wouldn't have to wait so long. Wouldn't it be nice if we could live together in the kind of world where we belong? This idea that, okay, the date's over. I don't want to go home by myself. I want to go home with you. Right? All of us have felt that feeling with our significant other. We all wanted to be together and stay together. And so the bride in chapter 1 talks about that kind of thing. In chapter 2, she talks about how much she loves the fact that he loves her. In chapter 3, she talks about a dream that she had that he disappeared. That somehow they were getting ready for their marriage and the king just was gone. Then at the latter part of that chapter, she finds him again. In chapter 4, the king talks about how much he adores his bride. And she replies, inviting him to her garden of marital delights. And if you've not read that passage, that's an interesting passage, the way she describes her love and what she has waiting for him. Another dream of her lover's disappearance happens in 5. Then we talk about the Shulamite, the loveliest among all of the 140 beauties of the palace. Right? We've got, I've got it backwards, 60 brides and 80 concubines. So there's 80 people that Solomon has had in his bed. But she's more beautiful than all of them. She's the prize. She's the most important one. And she's recognized by them as being more beautiful than they are, and she's recognized by the king as being more beautiful than they are. And then I wanted to read chapter 7, because chapter 7 has a good representation of all the stuff that they're saying. And I would do this with the girls in class and just have them kind of keep notes and then share them back with the guys. It was fun teaching a mixed group at the college, because when we were talking about Scripture, I could get the girls to give the guys some hints as to what was appropriate and what was not appropriate. Like in Matthew, when Jesus says, If a man looks at a woman to lust after her, he's committed adultery with her already in his heart. And I would ask the girls, when does it become creepy? You want a guy to notice you. You want him to see you. You want to be desirable. But at what point is the guy walking down the sidewalk, he's leering at you, or he turns around to look at you as you walk by? When does it get creepy? And so we would have an opportunity to kind of let the guys know where the girls were coming from in these things. And so in this chapter, I would just ask them, which one of these are compliments that would get a date? And which of these are compliments that would not get a date? All right, so chapter 7, verse 1, how beautiful are your sandaled feet, O prince's daughter. That one pretty good? Yeah, that's not bad. Your graceful legs are like jewels, the work of an artist's hands. All right, you got nice legs. Your navel is a rounded goblet that never lacks blended wine. That one's a little odd. Your waist is a mound of wheat encircled by lilies. Your breasts are like two fawns, like twin fawns of a gazelle. Your neck is like an ivory tower. Okay, you've got a long neck, and it gets a little worse. Your eyes are like the pools of Heshbon by the gate of Bath Rabbim, and your nose is like the tower of Lebanon, looking toward Damascus. Do I get the date? No, no. Usually by this point they were like, well, we like the you got nice legs part, but your nose is like the tower of Lebanon. Not so much. Your head crowns you like Mount Carmel. Your hair is like royal tapestry. The king is held captive by its tresses. How beautiful you are and how pleasing you are, my love, with all of your delights. Your stature is like a palm. Your breasts are like clusters of fruit. And I said, I will climb the palm tree, and I will take hold of its fruit. May your breasts be like clusters of grapes on the vine. The fragrance of your breath is like apples, and your mouth like the best wine. Right? Does this guy like her? Right? He is enthralled with her. They're getting ready to become husband and wife. Is it appropriate for a man who's engaged to be married to a woman to say nice things like this? It's pushing the envelope a little bit in our culture. In their culture, it was acceptable. And he was the king of Israel. Right? So he can pretty much say what he wants to say. So he's giving her all kinds of compliments. And again, some of them, the girls would say, yeah, I'd love for a guy to say that to me. And some of them, no, that's creepy. I wouldn't want a guy to ever say anything like that to me. So he ends with, your mouth is like the best wine. So she answers, may the wine go straight to my beloved, flowing gently over lips and teeth. I belong to my beloved, and his desire is for me. Come, my beloved, let's go to the countryside. Let's spend the night in the villages. Let's go early to the vineyards to see if the vines have budded, if their blossoms have opened, if the pomegranates are in bloom. There I will give you my love. The mandrakes send out their fragrance, and at our door is every delicacy, both new and old, that I have stored up for you, my beloved. It's early spring. And she says, it's time for us to be married. It's time for us to come together. For a long time, and I guess maybe still, the idea was people got married in June. Right? You finished the early planting. You got finished with school if you were going to school. And then in June, people got married. So there were a lot of anniversaries in June. But she says, let's go see if the vines are budding yet. Let's go out by ourselves in the vineyards. Let's go be alone in nature. And then there I will give you my love. And then she mentions the mandrakes. Mandrakes were considered by the ancient people to be an aphrodisiac. So she's saying, I want you to take me somewhere private so that we can be alone and share our love. So again, when people have read this through the years, it was difficult for them to say, okay, that's scripture. Obviously, that belongs in the book of books. But Paul says, All Scripture is given by inspiration of God. So there's something in this that we can use, something that is attainable. Well, it may not be attainable for a younger person who's not married or who's not getting married, but it's certainly attainable for someone who is. If you haven't ever read all 8 chapters, I would encourage you to do that, to just sit down and read through it. There's beautiful imagery between two people who are extremely in love and who can't wait for their wedding day. They just want to be together. She wants to please him, he wants to please her. They want the day to be today. And so this play or this writing for their wedding is all about their love for each other. Give you a little bit of chapter 8 because it's even a little bit more strange. She starts with, in the first, she says, "If only you were like my brother, who was nursed at my mother's breasts. Then, if I found you outside, I could kiss you, and no one would despise me. I would lead you and bring you to my mother's house, she who has taught me. I would give you spiced wine to drink, the nectar of my pomegranates. His left arm is under my head, his right arm embraces me. Daughters of Jerusalem, I charge you, do not arouse or awaken love until it so desires." It says, how can we wait? It's so exciting to be in love. And so I just, if we were family members, then I could just run up and grab you and just give you a big old kiss out in public, and people would go, "Oh yeah, that's her brother." But you're not. If you were my brother, I could just take you home with me. I'd take you to my mom's house, and we could at least be together. But you remember in chapter 1, she says, I have to be over here with my flocks and herds, and you're over there, and we can't even be together, because their custom was to be remain separated until it was time for them to be husband and wife. So she's frustrated, he's frustrated. Everybody wants to get back together. In verse 11 of chapter 8, Solomon had a vineyard in Baal Hamon. He let it out to tenants. Each was to bring for its fruit 1,000 shekels of silver. But my own vineyard is mine to give. The 1,000 shekels are for you, Solomon. The 200 are for those who tend its fruit. Then the husband answers, "You who dwell in the gardens with friends and attendants, let me hear your voice." And she says, "Come away, my beloved, and be like a gazelle or a young stag on the spice-laden mountains." And that's how it ends. So, they're just going back and forth, like you used to go back and forth on the telephone, like you used to go back and forth riding down the street holding hands in your daddy's car, just saying, soon, it's getting closer. It's almost time when we can actually be together and be our own couple, be our own family. So it's a beautiful, beautiful writing. But again, it says some things that people wrestle with because it's in Scripture. Very useful for counseling, very useful for encouraging married couples. But again, some folks stammer and stagger a little bit when they come across it. Any thoughts?